Do you know where coffee comes from? Now, if you were to say that it comes from the hand sticking out of the drive-thru window, I wouldn't say that you're wrong, but that's not really what I'm talking about. Obviously, it's common knowledge that coffee is made from coffee beans, but do you know how and where we get those beans? Let's start with how they're grown. Do they grow on a beanstalk, or a bush, or maybe a tree? And I'll tell you that one right now, coffee is actually grown on trees. But once the beans are grown, how does it go from something that's fresh and growing in a field to the dark, rich, and delicious nutty beverage that we know and love? Well, I could tell you the answers to all those questions, but since I just traveled over 5,000 miles to go visit a coffee farm, let me show you where coffee comes from. If you haven't figured it out by now, the farm that I went to is the Kona Earth farm in Kona, Hawaii. Now, I should mention that most of the things I'm going to show you in this video are generally true of coffee farming all over the world, but some of them are exclusive to the Kona area, and a few are only true of the Kona Earth farm itself. Now, the first thing you need to know in this video is that coffee is grown inside of a fruit called a cherry. Now, calling this a coffee cherry is a little bit confusing because it's really nothing like an eating cherry, except that maybe it's bright red when it's ripe. So just know that throughout the rest of this video, anytime I say cherry, unless I specifically say an eating cherry, I'm talking about coffee cherries. Anyway, we flew out there in October, which is toward the beginning of harvest season in Kona, and after winding our way through what seemed like endless switchbacks up the side of the volcano, we finally arrived at the farm. So I'm finally here. I'm at the Kona Earth farm in the heart of the Kona coffee belt, and as you can see, we've got cherries that are ripe and ready to go behind me. So today's the first day of one of the rounds of picking that we're gonna do here. So coffee is kind of unique. It doesn't ripen all at once. You'll get flowers, green cherries, almost ripe cherries, and then fully ripe cherries that are ready to be harvested all at the same time. And so you pick only the ripe ones, and every 30 to 40 days you'll have another round of picking, and that could last 5-6 rounds at a time, and each tree can produce up to 10 pounds of ripe cherry per round of picking. So when you look at a branch on a coffee tree, you'll see that you have green cherries and red cherries all mixed together. You'll even see what looks like a full ripe bunch of red cherries, and there's a couple green ones hiding underneath. Or like on this branch, it's mostly green, but there's a couple of ripe ones here as well. And so the pickers have to go through very carefully and take out only the ripe ones, because those are the only beans that can actually be roasted. Those are the ones that are going to taste good. If any of the green ones make it through the harvesting process, they have to get culled out and they don't make it into the final product. So this is a ripe coffee cherry. I'm going to crack it open, and inside there are 2 coffee beans. Technically these are not beans but seeds, and you can see here that the outside skin is very thin. There's hardly anything there. Almost the whole volume is these big coffee beans. This is what fresh pulped coffee beans look like. They're interesting. They're kind of sweet, kind of floral, a little bit vegetal, kind of a green taste to them. It's not my favorite thing, but it's not unpleasant at all. And the skin, when you hear cherry, you'd think like eating cherries. It's nothing like that. These are really fibrous and kind of stringy. Not a lot of flavor to these, honestly. They're pretty tasteless, and it's kind of more like eating celery than eating an actual eating cherry. Now, I grew up working in the eating cherry orchards on the eastern side of Washington state, and so I was expecting pretty large trees and big ladders used to reach the fruit in the top of those branches. So I was pretty shocked to learn that instead of using ladders to raise themselves up, the pickers actually use wooden hooks to pull the branches down to their level. Again, with my background working in agriculture, I couldn't wait to strap on a picking bucket and give it a try. I wasn't really prepared for how difficult the coffee cherries are to pick. Unlike eating cherries, which require gentle hands and more of a push and lift to unhook them from the branch, coffee cherries do not let go easily, and it was immediately apparent that it took a fair bit of brute force to just yank them off the tree. Wow. I cannot imagine doing this for 9 hours straight. This is a lot harder than it looks. You get a new respect for the people that are out here picking and doing a good job, trying to keep the green cherries out of the bucket. It really is a lot more skilled than you'd think. I'm really impressed. After learning how difficult coffee picking is, co-owner Steve took me on a tour of the farm and pulled back the curtain on some of their future plans and showed me the parts of the farm that had just been planted with new trees.
And they come in these tubes, and you got to drill a hole, and then on your knees go from one to the next. But this is all red Caturra.
That's a little different than the Kona, the typical thing people grow. What is that? The Kona typica,
Well,
right?
There's Kona typica, there's red Bourbon, there's Geisha. There's over 120 varieties from the original Arabica beans. And they all have different little profiles. And each one grows better in higher elevation, and some grow better in lower elevation. Red Caturra, red Bourbon will do really well at this elevation. These will take about 3 years to mature and start producing the maximum amount of cherry, which is about 10 pounds of cherry per round of 5 to 6 rounds of picking. Every 30 days, 40 days, the next harvest happens. Wow. So harvest season's a long time.
And these have a little bit of a different flavor than the Kona typica, a little bit fruitier, right?
They do. Yeah. They do. It's a dwarf tree, a little more fruit forward, but should work really well with the Kona typica.
Yeah.
And we are planning on selling these as a separate, you know, if it has a really nice profile that the customers like.
There's got to be a lot of cool things you could do blending the two flavors. You know,
absolutely.
And some people are going to want more of that classic Kona flavor until they try something like this. I think that's the thing. It's just like wine. You might think that one wine is your favorite and you try something else and realize, oh, I like them both. I'm excited to try these when they finally are mature.
Yeah, me too.
Now, one of the things that I learned right away about Steve is that he's not afraid to buck convention and do things his own way. And the place where this is most obvious is with herbicides, or weed killers. You see, Steve doesn't use them at all. Most farmers use a glyphosate-based spray around the bottom of their trees to keep the weeds in check. And you might think that it's an easy choice to just not use a poison spray, but you have to understand that the weeds we're talking about here are not something that a farmer can just ignore. These are strong, healthy, and aggressive plants that are competing with the trees for nutrients and water. If a farmer does nothing about them, they grow so well in the fertile soil and sunshine that they will actually grow up around and through the branches of the coffee tree, choking it out and making it far less productive. Not only that, it also makes pruning and fertilizing, picking, and even just walking around on the steep slopes of the farm really difficult to do. The only way to function as a coffee farm without using weed killers is to mow, trim, and pull the weeds manually. And that is a lot of hard work. But for Steve and Joanie, it's worth it, not just for the health and safety of everyone working at the farm, but choosing to not use harmful chemicals in their fields means it can never get into their coffee trees, and those same chemicals can never get into your coffee. Now, I've never been someone who's especially fixated on reading food labels, but to me, this is just such an obvious choice that I couldn't imagine following a different path myself. For a farmer, your field is your workplace, but it's also your home. It's where you spend your time, it's where you pour your love and passion into the growing things you care for, and it's often where your children grow up. Not only do I want to drink coffee that tastes amazing, I also don't want to put anything into my body that's potentially harmful. And I also want to know that I'm not encouraging farmers to make bad choices for their long-term health just so that I can have my morning coffee. And you know, Steve and Joanie don't have to do it this way, but it's those behind-the-scenes decisions that really help to make Kona Earth so special. After the coffee is picked, it is loaded into large burlap sacks and brought to the processing area where it is carefully weighed and each picker's amount is recorded. The following day, the coffee cherries are poured into the hopper of the processing machine where they go through several stages. In the first stage, they fall into a large tank of water. Cherries containing beans that were damaged by pests or other causes float to the surface where they are skimmed off while the good cherries sink to the bottom and are pumped to the top of the pulping machine. Cherries then roll down a screen and fall into a rotating drum mechanism that peels the red outer layer off the beans. From there, the beans move into another rotating drum, and this one is made from long steel rods. Here, fully separated beans fall down between the rods, while any whole cherries that survived the peeling stage slide along to the end of the drum and fall into a bucket. Steve then takes these whole cherries and feeds them back into the top of the machine so that they can be properly peeled. Green cherries are too hard to be peeled, even with multiple passes, so they cannot pass through the wire drum and are effectively separated from the ripe beans by this process. Beans that have been successfully peeled are moved to a third and final drum to remove the translucent, thick, and sticky outer layer called mucilage. This drum is stationary while inside a rotating auger at the bottom and spinning steel rods at the top force the beans against the outside of the drum where the slots in the metal scrape off the mucilage. Once done, the beans are collected into a wheelbarrow, then wheeled over onto the dry deck where they are dumped and spread out to dry in the sun. All of the unripe as well as damaged cherries and the peeled skins are collected and composted, and Steve uses the rich black topsoil made from these cherries as a special fertilizer which he spreads around any trees that need more nutrients. Just as with picking, it was important for me to actually get my hands dirty and do this process myself, and Steve couldn't agree more. Although it's loud, the coffee bags are heavy and awkward, everything gets sticky from the sugar in the cherries, and of course it's hot and humid, I gotta say, it was a lot of fun. When you rake the beans out to dry, you start to get this sense that, oh yeah, we're making coffee. Even though the beans are a long way from being ready to brew, this is the first point in the process where things start to look familiar. I will say it smells nothing like roasted coffee. It's kind of this sweet, floral, kind of fermented smell, but you can see the end in sight. Alright, so I'm here in the Kona Earth storeroom, and this is where the coffee comes after its initial drying phase up on the dry deck, and the coffee's going to sit in here in what we call a parchment stage for about 90 days or so before it goes off to a mill to have the outer part here removed. And that outer part has to be removed before it's roasted. There's a big difference between beans that are at this stage versus beans that have been milled. They're a lot smaller and they lose all of this kind of funky, papery outside. It's kind of like a peanut shell, honestly, and all that needs to go away. But before you do that, they hang out in here to make sure that that moisture content perfectly equalizes throughout all of them and make sure they're ready for the next stage, which would be milling. And once the coffee has been milled, which is done off-site by a special machine, which removes both the outer parchment layer and a hidden inner silvery kind of paper skin layer, the beans are then sorted into different sizes, and then at that point, they're ready to be roasted. But coffee roasting is what I'm going to talk about in the next episode, so I hope to see you there. Let's roll it again.